Hello and welcome to Other Voices, brought to you by Peninsula Peace and Justice Center. I'm your host, Paul George. On this month's edition of Other Voices, we're going to take a look at a couple of America's ongoing so-called trade wars. First of all, there's the back and forth tariff war between the United States and China, with billions of dollars of imports at stake and billions of dollars of consumer dollars at stake. We're going to take a good look at that. And the other trade war is one that may actually end up in Congress. This past January 1st marked the 25th anniversary of NAFTA going into force, the North American Free Trade Agreement. That agreement has been renegotiated by Trump, and the new agreement has to be approved by Congress. That's where that trade war might take place. To help us understand what's going on these different aspects of U.S. and international trade, I'm really glad to be welcoming back to Other Voices Jack Rasmus. Jack holds a PhD in political economy and teaches economics at St. Mary's College. He's the author of numerous books on economics and politics. Jack is also the host of the weekly radio show Alternative Visions on the Progressive Radio Network, and a journalist writing on economic, political, and labor issues for a wide array of magazines. Jack, welcome back to Other Voices. Glad to have you here.
Pleasure to be here again.
You've been here several times. Whenever we seem to have some kind of economic crisis, you always seem willing to come and talk to us about it. Let's start with these sanctions, the sanction back and forth between the U.S. and China. This started out as steel and aluminum tariffs, not just on China, but on Canada, Mexico, Europe, lots of countries in South America. Every place we buy steel or aluminum. Very quickly, exemptions were made for most of those countries, starting with Brazil, and then the others got exemptions. But the tariffs with China have stayed on, and then additional tariffs have been put in place on, is it $54 billion worth now of goods being imported from China? First of all, talk about the process, how we got here, what the effect generally is on tariffs. And then I want to get into what Trump may actually be after here, because he says it has to do with the trade deficit. I suspect you might have a different opinion of that.
Well, the trade deficit, goods deficit for the U.S. this past year was $800 billion.
That sounds like a lot of...
A record, despite all the tariffs and all the trade action and so forth. It's not getting better, it's getting worse.
What's it been in previous years?
Well, it's been less than that. It's risen about 40 billion here in the last couple of years. So, you know, it's a problem. That's the good side. The U.S. runs a surplus, not a deficit, on services. So when you reduce the amount of services surplus from the deficit, you know, you're around $700 billion running deficit every year.
And I just want to interrupt a sec, because I think it's important that people really try to get an understanding of what a trade deficit means. Trump always talks about it in terms of we're losing money. Are we losing money?
Well, dollars are flowing out of the United States into the rest of the world economy, but that's been going on ever since Ronald Reagan. Every year we've run a deficit, more exports into the U.S. than we export out of the U.S.
Was there anything policy-wise that Reagan did to switch that, or is just the way things have evolved? More manufacturing offshore leads to more importing of goods that used to be manufactured here?
Well, part of the reason is when you have the value of the dollar rising, it reduces your exports and increases your imports. And under Ronald Reagan, we had a huge increase in the value of the dollar, and that wreaked havoc on our trade deficit. We used to run pretty much a balance, pretty close to a balance up until Ronald Reagan. And ever since then, we've run this huge deficit, growing more in some times and less in other times, but a deficit all the time. But people should understand this trade deficit is tied into our budget deficit.
Okay.
Interesting. Here's how, right? Well, when you have all of the dollars flowing out of the country with a trade deficit, the U.S. has manage this agreement with all the countries that's running this trade deficit for them to recycle those dollars, this includes China and Japan, the biggest, back to the U.S. to buy U.S. Treasury bonds, okay? And that enables Congress to run a huge budget deficit because the money is coming back, a huge budget deficit that is caused primarily by tax cuts, primarily on businesses and investors, and increased defense spending. So you have this anomaly, this phenomenon, particularly since 2000, when we are running huge budget deficits caused by tax cuts and defense war spending, trillions of dollars I'm talking about.
Yeah.
It's been over $10 trillion in tax cuts since George W. Bush, and it's been $6–7 trillion in extra defense spending because of the wars in the Middle East. But the money coming back from the trade deficit enables us to run this huge budget deficit. This is called the twin deficits.
Because the Treasury notes are what finances the deficit.
That's right.
It's borrowed money, basically.
That's right. It's borrowed money, and that's why the U.S. debt is rising, now over $21 trillion, the federal government debt. And we're going to look at trillion-dollar deficits and $1 trillion a year added to our national debt every year for the next 10 years because of the Trump tax cuts and the Trump increased defense spending, primarily. Those are the two main causes. $1 trillion every year, and if we have a recession, it's going to be more than $1 trillion, and that's as far as the eye can see because of these domestic policies, right?
Didn't we already try this under Reagan? Cut taxes, increase defense spending?
We've been doing this ever since Reagan, and that includes the Democrats when they were in office and the Republicans.
Yeah.
And this is sometimes called neoliberalism, right? These mixture of related policies. But the whole thing about the trade war that we see now is an attempt to try to offset that a little bit, to offset the flow of money out of the country, to mitigate the need to have so much foreign purchasers now, which is like 40–50% foreigners buy our treasury bonds, to offset it. So whenever you have a crisis, you have a trade war. We had a trade war under Nixon, where he targeted Europe.
Europe, yeah.
And we had a trade war under Reagan, where he targeted Japan. And now we have a trade war targeting China. So trade wars are always follow in the wake of these massive tax cuts and defense run-ups, defense spending run-ups that run up the deficit, the budget deficit. They're all related, you see. Everything in economics policy is pretty much interrelated.
So trying to balance the books, so to speak, through a trade war.
To try
Instead
to
of doing
offset
it in Congress like they should.
In part.
In part. Okay.
If you believe a trade war is all about trade deficits, which it really isn't, particularly in the case of China, you see. The China trade war really began last March, and it really was about three main objectives the U.S. had.
That's when Trump announced these whole round of tariffs.
Right. Well, he actually led with the steel and aluminum, but that was the stalking horse because, as you mentioned, even though Trump has implemented tariffs on steel and aluminum, there's 4,000 or more exemptions for U.S. companies. So it's tariffs in word only, you see. I believe there is a dual-track trade policy with Trump. One is a phony trade war with U.S. allies, a token trade war, and the real trade war is with China. And the objectives of the U.S. are threefold with China. One, to increase China purchases of U.S. goods, particularly farm goods. Secondly, to allow U.S. companies, especially banks, to have majority access to companies they purchase and do business with in China. And thirdly, the third objective of the U.S. is to somehow slow down China's development of next-generation technologies. These next-generation technologies are 5G wireless, artificial intelligence, and cybersecurity. They are not only the source of the new industries of the next decade, they are military-related technologies. And if China gets a lead in that, the U.S. is concerned that they may be able 10, 20 years from now, leapfrog the U.S. militarily. So on the U.S. trade negotiating team, there's three factions. One is interested in increasing China purchase of farm goods. The other is interested in U.S. Companies getting a majority ownership in China. And the third is to stop the technology transfer and technology development. Now, China has already agreed to the first two. Back in May, there was an agreement between China and Steve Mnuchin, Treasury Secretary, went to China, came back, said we got an agreement with China. China agreed to the 51% ownership or more, which the bankers in particular want. And China agreed to purchase $100 billion more every year of U.S. farm goods. But China did not agree on the technology issue. And we have a hardliner faction in the U.S. negotiating team led by Robert Lighthizer, the trade negotiating chief, but also other factions, John Bolton, and other factions in the Pentagon and the industrial military complex and their friends in Congress, who do not want an agreement with China just on those first two elements, the deficit, the purchase, and the access to markets over there. And they blew it up in May. They got to Trump, and Trump says, no, okay, we don't have an agreement yet. And they blew it up, and they've been in control of U.S. negotiations ever since. However, that appears to be breaking down now, and the negotiations that are underway as we talk, we will see how they come out in terms of any concessions China is willing to make on the technology issue, and the U.S. is willing to accept as satisfactory on the technology issue. The two issues are already agreed to. The third one is still not agreed to, and we'll see how that turns out. I've been predicting since last summer that there will be an agreement, by the way, and that agreement will occur before summer, if not by March, when the deadline is current negotiations expires. There will be an agreement between the two parties.
So I want to dig into this a little bit deeper because, frankly, I don't fully understand this. With farm products, that's pretty easy. China agrees to buy more farm products from the U.S. and maybe skip Brazil and buy its soybeans from us. And they've agreed to allow majority ownership of Chinese corporations. That's pretty easy. But what is it that the United States is looking for in the technology field? Because you think of advances in technology, this is research and development. It's not an export-import item. So what particularly are they looking for in terms of concessions on in the technology sector?
Well, you see in the news almost perpetually, the U.S. is going after China technology companies, trying to make purchases of U.S. companies or do business with U.S. companies in the U.S. ZTE Corporation, Huawei Corporation, and the U.S. is even getting its allies in Canada and the U.K. and elsewhere to take the same hardline stance about Chinese tech companies linking up with U.S. and its ally companies because they believe that kind of a link-up will allow China cybersecurity initiatives to succeed better, you see. So also the U.S. is concerned about U.S. corporations doing business in China and China requiring those corporations to share the technology with the government
as a condition
of doing business.
So rather than domestically developing and researching, developing this technology, they're bringing in U.S. corporations and insisting,
now the
bring your patents with you, basically.
The code word for this is intellectual property, but that's software, right? Software is technology. So when you hear the U.S. use the term, they're violating intellectual property, a good part of that really means technology. The U.S. wants to, and is going to, no matter what, stop Chinese corporations purchasing and doing business with U.S. corporations. They're going to do that no matter what agreement comes out of this. But they want China to lift its requirements in China that American companies must share their technology development in China. And there's a lot of American companies...
Just for the right of doing business in China.
That's right, yeah. People don't realize that a lot of the imports from China to the U.S. are from American companies in China bringing their products back to the U.S. In fact,
Apple phones are famously put together in China at the infamous Foxconn factories.
Foxconn factories, right.
So the tariffs are affecting Apple phones.
Except that the tariffs have not been that effective to date. That's why there hasn't been a real trade war yet with China. You see, you could put 10% tariffs on Chinese goods being imported to the U.S., but if China's currency devalues by 10%, it's a wash.
It's a yes.
Okay, and that's pretty much what has happened. So the first 50 billion, 25% tariffs took effect. But 50 billion out of the U.S. total imports from everywhere of like 2.3 trillion is just a pittance. You see, it's not that big an effect.
How much is it just vis-a-vis China?
Well, China, we run somewhere close to $400 billion net goods and services trade deficit a year. Trade deficit. So 50 billion out of that is a good percentage. Trump added another 100 billion to that with only 10%, not 25%. The Chinese matched the 25 and they matched the 10%, although the total's not 150 billion of goods. And then Trump threatened another 250 billion, which would mean just about all the Chinese imports, but he didn't implement anything yet. He was supposed to implement it on January 1st, but they kicked that can down the road and said, let's negotiate. And we're going to give you 90 days to negotiate.
So we've got till the end of March, is it?
Yes, just about.
This deal.
And they're negotiating, right now, both sides and both parties. And the number 2 economic minister in China is coming over to the U.S. and he's going to negotiate once again with Steve Mnuchin and Lighthizer. But we don't know who's really dominating the U.S. negotiating team. Is it the anti-China, anti-technology hardliners, Lighthizer, Bolton, Navarro, Peter Navarro, right? Or is it the bankers, Mnuchin and others? He's the next Goldman Sachser running the Treasury Department now, and all they really want is to get the 51% or more control of their finance operations in China.
It would sound like Wall Street's goals have already been met in this.
Exactly, and so has the farm sector. Yeah. Their goals, agribusiness, their goals have been met as well. What's holding it up is the anti-China technology military faction of the U.S. trade team. And we will see whether they actually prevail here. And what they want is to stop any agreement with China unless their technology demands are met by China. Now, I predict what's going to happen is China will come up with some language that placates the U.S. team enough that in the long run they can do an end run around anyway. So it will appear as if there is a settlement even on the technology, but it's still an unknown whether Lighthizer, Navarro, and others will find that acceptable. Now, both economies are weakening. The U.S. economy is weak. It's going to be much weaker this first quarter, and it's not really due to the shutdown. Autos and construction and everything has already been slowing down. There's a global economy slowdown. Manufacturing is slowing down. Autos are in trouble. So the U.S. economy first quarter this year, I predict, is going to come in much lower than it did in the fourth quarter. And China is slowing down as well. So you've got these economic pressures that I am predicting will force the two parties to come to some sort of an agreement, part of which will be real on the first two proposals, part of which will be cover on the technology issue.
Enough so that Trump can claim a win.
That's right.
I think most leaders around the world are coming to realize that that's how you deal with Donald Trump. You don't have to deliver anything substantial. You just have to deliver something he can tell his base is a victory.
Well, that's why I said we had this other phony second-track trade war with U.S. allies. Korea was the first template of this deal. Korea was like the third largest steel importer, I think, to the U.S. The deal they agreed upon and finalized imposed no tariffs on Korean steel. Okay, there was some token provisions about quotas on autos and trucks, and the Koreans were ecstatic. They got off the hook totally here.
Yeah, if I'm remembering this right, Korea's initial reaction was Trump had wanted to renegotiate the Korea Free Trade Agreement, bilateral, and Korea said, okay, let's do that, and they did, and it was modestly renegotiated, and Trump could say, I won, I got a great new deal out of Korea.
Trump was going after steel and auto tariffs and all the others as part of his attempt to show he's tough on economic nationalism before the November elections. This had a lot to do with November elections. The China war is a separate track, but as far as going after Korea and Brazil, there was a token effort to go after European autos, and that was put on the back burner. And then there was the NAFTA deal, which is also pretty much a token deal in many ways.
We're going to talk about NAFTA in a little bit
as well.
Yeah. I want to go back to this technology sector. You've explained this nicely and broken it down. The farmers and big ag they're happy, and Wall Street is happy. When I look at the technology sector, I think of two major centers that would have opinions about this. One would be the technology companies themselves. We're sitting here in the middle of Silicon Valley after all. So my question is, what do they want out of this? Do they mind this technology sharing, or are they looking to change the trade policies on the technology that they're selling in and to China? And the other sector involved there, you mentioned this, would be the Pentagon, because this is security, national security, military related stuff. And what do they want? So when you look at the financial services sector, it's pretty easy to say, we know what Wall Street wants, and boom, they got it, 51% investment. You know what big ag wants, more markets, boom, they got that. What does big technology and what does big defense really want out of these trade
Well,
deals?
big tech wants to be able to expand and do business in China.
Yeah.
I mean, this is the big market for it. And that would suggest they don't want to have any changes, but if they are under attack from various quarters in the U.S., politically because of surveillance and privacy and so forth. So they don't want to aggravate U.S. government and political forces by looking like they just don't want to make any change. They want to share their technology. They don't want to do that either. They're kind of in a rock and a hard, between a rock and a hard place.
Yeah.
And they're dancing, right? They're dancing. They're trying to not look like they're anti-China to the Chinese, and they're trying to look like they're cooperating with the U.S. and its attempt to control technology. Okay, so that's pretty much where they are. Now, not all tech, but tech that has to do with cybersecurity, tech that has to do with broadband wireless, which is called 5G, and artificial intelligence. Artificial intelligence is really the key to a whole host of industries and economic growth in the 2020s decade, because it's going to take off in another 3 or 4 years. A lot of spin-off businesses, a lot of spin-off profits and possibilities there. The U.S. and China are the two economies that are filing most of the patents on AI. Germany is in far behind third, and everyone else is not even there. So it's a war for who's going to control the technology of the futures between these two behemoths, you see. And these technologies have significant military capabilities, because what AI is about is taking away the simple decision-making by human beings and giving it to smart software that will make the decisions faster, better, and more efficiently. Now, you can imagine what that means for military hardware and software to make the decisions faster, more efficient, fail-safe, and so forth.
It also means a machine will be making the decision whether to pull the trigger on a human being or not.
It could be. It could be. But, AI is really about, not to go too much on a digression, but AI is really three things. It's massive data. It's the ability to access and process that with processing power that is massive processing power. And it's really customized software and advanced statistical analysis. That's what AI is. And AI takes away simple decision makings. By the way, McKinsey consultants reported that by 2025, 30% of all the occupations in the U.S. will be negatively impacted. They will either disappear or their hours of work will be reduced because of AI.
30%?
30%.
By when?
By 2025.
Huh.
Now, that's a massive hit that's going to go on to the economy that's coming, that's going to make everything else pale in comparison. And what are we going to, that's another question, what we're going to do about that. But the two countries' economies are racing towards implementing AI and all the new technologies that will flow from it that have extreme military implications. And that's what the Pentagon and the military-industrial complex and you know, the surveillance agencies, you know, the NSA and all of them are really worried about. The U.S. has to, they believe, maintain a very clear lead in these new technologies, or it's going to, you know, negate all the investment we've made in aircraft carriers and jet aircraft. And
all
so
this
on and so
hardware.
forth. All this hardware out
will
there
be rendered useless because
right.
of the software.
That's right.
Yeah. Let's, before we move on to NAFTA, and I do want to do that, what have been the effects, measurable effects so far here in the U.S. or on our economy or on workers or jobs or whatever of the tariffs that are in place now? There was an interesting article in the New Yorker about the steel mill. The guy who runs it was a Trump fan, and now he's laying people off. They made nails. They make nails, and the cost of their steel to make the nails has gone up. They've had to raise prices. They're losing business. Is that just, did the New Yorker find, you know, the only factory that's having problems, or is this widespread? What are the effects of this?
Well, you know, the steel tariffs, the steel companies have not hired any new workers. What they've done is use the tariffs to raise their prices. There's no real gain in employment in the steel industry. The auto industry, as we know, the big auto companies are laying off by the thousands. You know, GM has announced 14,000, Ford 5,000. You know, there's going to be more layoffs.
Is that related to steel prices?
Well, it may be in part because the rising costs. As far as Mexico, the Mexican agreement, NAFTA 2.0 is concerned, the U.S. has agreed to not impose any tariffs at all on Mexican autos for the next several decades. What it negotiated was, Mexican automakers must raise their wages, but it doesn't say by when and how much, really, over what period of time.
And let's hold off on NAFTA, though, and stay with the tariffs and their effects here, and then we'll jump right into NAFTA.
So the tariffs, you know, as far as the steel and aluminum tariffs are concerned, as I said before, there's like 4,000 exemptions to them. So the tariffs have not really had that big effect.
The exemption is a U.S. company comes and says,
let us, you know, let's forego these tariffs. You know, let's continue paying the prices we were. Don't raise prices because of the tariffs on our offshore suppliers that we depend upon here. And there's exemptions everywhere. I mean, it's a big Swiss cheese. You know, the steel and auto tariffs are a big Swiss cheese. They're not really effective.
And what's the status of China's imports here of steel?
Well, China is, in terms of steel, is somewhere like the 14th or 15th importer.
So there are no exemptions for China, but there's no reason.
There's no reason. No.
So really no effect yet so far on.
It's a lot of smoke and mirrors. The trade war, steel tariffs, aluminum tariffs, you know, NAFTA, Korea, and Europe, and so forth. As I said, is a lot of smoke and mirrors.
Yeah. Are consumer prices on these imported goods going up as a result of the tariffs?
Well, as a result of the tariffs, in some cases, but not very many. You know, what we've got, for example, the latest figures on producer prices, which are, you know, goods that are used before you create consumer goods. it's negative. There's no increase in producer prices, so there's no import price inflation effect really hitting producer prices. And of course, it's not spilling over into consumer prices at all.
All right. Well, let's go ahead and move on to NAFTA. You've been anxious to talk about that. As I mentioned in the brief intro to this show, just a couple of weeks ago, January 1st, marks 25 years since the original NAFTA went into effect, the North American Free Trade Agreement between Mexico, the U.S., and Canada. Maybe the best place to start before we start talking about NAFTA 2.0, the recently negotiated one, is after 25 years, we should have a pretty clear idea of the effect of NAFTA. There were a lot of promises made. There were a lot of warnings made 25 years ago. Who was right? Was it a big benefit? Was it a big drag?
Well, it depends what industry and what company you're talking about.
Well,
okay, it's been a boon for American agribusiness. They sell a lot of agricultural goods into Mexico and from Mexico, elsewhere into the world. As far as the auto and manufacturing jobs, it's been a big negative for American workers. We've lost, various estimates are between 3 and 4 million jobs, most of them manufacturing jobs. For example, there was this major company in the U.S. called, an auto parts manufacturer called Delphi. Had 20-some plants and 100,000 workers in the U.S. All of those workers have been moved to Mexico. Yeah. All of them. Yeah. All its production occurs in Mexico. And of course, free trade means that American company that moved to Mexico now can move its goods and sell them in the U.S. Without a tariff. You see, that's really what free trade is about.
Well, saving a fortune on...
Saving a fortune. Not only on the lower costs, but now they don't pay any tariff, any import as well.
Yeah, the government has certified that NAFTA has cost the country 1 million American jobs, and I imagine there's a lot more that could be debated.
Yeah, the Economic Policy Institute has done a number of studies on this. People should just go and read their stuff. It's online. It's a very highly respected economic research institute, independent in Washington, and they repeatedly estimate, every several years or something, and the number is between 3 and 4 million of lost jobs.
Wow. Well, and another promise of NAFTA was that to raise wages, especially in Mexico, and apparently that hasn't happened.
Well, it has happened to some extent, but nowhere near close to what wages are in the United States. Those factories, U.S. factories that relocate to Mexico do pay higher wages than domestic factories in Mexico, but nonetheless, those wages are light years away from what the same occupation pays in the United States.
Yeah, and your example of this Delphi Corporation moving all these factories, going after the lower wages in Mexico. One of the things, and Peninsula Peace and Justice Center was centrally involved in the big NAFTA debate those 25, 27 years ago. One of the things we were saying is that's going to put downward pressure on U.S. wages. Have we seen that in these 25 years?
There's so many factors, forces putting downward pressure on U.S. wages, it's hard to separate out that one.
Yes,
but,
there's Washington policy to begin with.
There's a lot. There's a lot.
Okay. Yeah. Anything else about the outcome of NAFTA over these 25 years?
Well, NAFTA has resulted in a significant increase in Mexico of manufacturing employment, yes, as it's left the U.S. What it's done, U.S. agribusiness now provides most of the corn, which is a staple in Mexico, right? And small Mexican farmers for decades now have not been able to compete with that low-price U.S. corn for tortillas and everything else, right? And certain areas of corn production in Mexico have been devastated, and as a result, the farmers pick up and they go north. And in Michoacan and places like that has been devastated, and a lot of those people have moved. So U.S. Free trade policy has promoted and incentivized immigration from Central America, at least from Mexico, to the U.S., and that's often not really discussed very much, you see.
Yeah, not surprising, given current company around here. So there's this new agreement. Trump, during the campaign, called NAFTA the worst trade deal ever negotiated, and he swore he was going to tear it up and start over. Yeah. And what he ended up with, he's calling the U.S. Mexico-Canada agreement, USMCA. Everybody else, at least on the progressive side, seems to be referring to it as NAFTA 2.0 because it really isn't a whole new trade deal. It's some changes, and actually some positive ones from my read, but what's your first initial overall take on NAFTA 2.0?
It's in the spirit of the Korean softball free trade deal, I would say, right? The template, which is South Korea. And as I was mentioning before, Mexican auto production, all major U.S. auto companies down there, Mexican auto production, there's no tariffs on any of that. Nothing, has been imposed on any of those imports into the U.S. The U.S., the free trade deal is really also about foreign direct investment. If you read NAFTA, a lot of those provisions are about terms and conditions in which U.S. companies can do investment in Mexico. It's not just about goods flowing back and forth. It's about money flowing into Mexico.
I think a lot of people forget that aspect of these free trade agreements because, the TPP that Obama was negotiating, I think something like 3/4 of that agreement, literally of the pages, and it was huge, had to do with financial services and not the exchange of goods.
That's right.
And that was a major part of that, and that's a major part of NAFTA. So they've tweaked some of that in 2.0, is that?
There's some minor changes there. An interesting change, both Canada and Mexico, is that neither Canada or Mexico, now as part of the new NAFTA 2.0, can strike independent trade deals, free trade deals with China. That's to prevent China coming into Canada or Mexico, and thereby coming into the United States.
Which they've been doing, actually.
Which they've been doing.
Right.
But what it really means is that it's an attack on, say, Canadian sovereignty. You can't negotiate with other countries as a sovereign country, right?
Yeah.
So that's a provision in that deal. The trade adjudication, in other words, trade disputes provision was not changed. The Canadians liked that because it favored U.S. businesses in Canada and Mexico when there are disputes about something.
Yeah, the investor-state dispute settlement, ISDS.
And the U.S. Congress, because it's a treaty, cannot pass laws, and neither can Canadian Parliament, cannot pass laws that in any way negate the terms of the free trade deal. So when you negotiate a treaty, you give up some of your sovereignty, you see. And that hasn't changed at all. What's changed with Canada was some provisions that Trump made a big deal about it on U.S. Dairy products, as it was called. They're importing into Canada. They want more dairy products into Canada. Well, you think maybe that means Minnesota milk farmers will be able to sell more milk into Canada. Well, that's not really what that provision is about. It's about processed milk products that Canada thought were unsafe, made in the U.S., that Canada would not allow to be imported in the U.S., but now those processed milk products, which is by food manufacturing companies, you see, can be allowed to be sold into Canada. So it's not the U.S. farmer, it's the U.S. Food manufacturers who got a bigger deal. And also the pharmaceuticals, there's changes that allow the U.S. pharmaceutical companies to sell more U.S. drugs without going through inspection and other processes in those two trading partners. So it's a boon to U.S. big pharma. It's a boon to U.S. manufacturing, food manufacturers. But they're the great beneficiaries. It doesn't do anything for U.S. workers, manufacturing or steel or auto or anything. There's no, in fact, if anything, autos from Canada, there's a quota was raised now. Instead of 2 million autos a year imported from Canada, they can raise it to 2.6. So they actually gave the Canadians more opportunity to import more autos into the United States, you see.
We're importing autos from Canada?
Oh, yeah, big time.
But
auto
U.S. autos?
Yes.
Made in Canada?
U.S. auto companies in Canada, yeah, just as we're doing it from Mexico, by the way.
Yeah, which is some of the factories that have moved down there. There is this, when NAFTA was negotiated, and I know you've worked a lot with labor unions for many years in various positions, including being a local president, right? Mm-hmm. Back when NAFTA was first being negotiated and being battled through Congress, labor was saying we need more protections for workers on both sides of both borders. And apparently in this agreement there is some additional protection for workers, especially in Mexico, where there's a provision that now 40 to 45% of the value of something being manufactured in Mexico must be produced by workers earning $16 an hour or more. And it applies to everyone, but auto manufacturers, auto workers in the U.S. and Canada already make far more than $16 an hour. So this is aimed at Mexico. But as in other trade agreements, the problem here seems to be there's no enforcement mechanism. And the only people who have the data about 40% of the workers getting $16 or more are the Mexican companies. How's labor feel about this new NAFTA 2.0?
Well, it's unenforceable, you see, because it doesn't say $16 by when. It just says $16. There's no schedule that says, I mean, maybe it's 10 years from now, maybe it's 5 years from now, right? There's no real schedule, and there's no way of, since it's only on 40% of the auto workers, right? There's no way of actually getting the data from those companies' operations that show what the wages are for occupation by occupation, and then to see how much it's changed from year to year to estimate whether the $16 has been implemented. It's, you know, it's pie in the sky.
Yeah, and in fact, I think this provision does take effect whenever this is going to take effect. But another one of the flaws is that the $16 is written in so that 10 years from now, they'll still be looking for a $16 wage. And if you were making $16 in 2019, you don't want to be making $16 an hour in 2029.
Well, so, that's what I said. You don't index it, and you just delay it, and it's not $16. It's something less. And
the same thing with, on the other side, environmentalists wanted more protections. NAFTA didn't address environmental protections much at all. The labor and environmental protections that activists were demanding in that first round were actually negotiated in a side agreement that has no enforcement. Those protections as they exist in NAFTA 2.0 are within the main agreement, but again, with no enforcement. And the environmental protections are one of the more interesting things in here, because if, say, and this has happened a lot, a Canadian company wants to come and build a pipeline in the United States and they're turned down for environmental protection reasons, they can sue under this investor-state dispute settlement and say, you're denying us profit. And in fact, the United States has had to pay hundreds of millions of dollars for lost profits to Canadian companies that wanted to come down here and manufacture in a way that would pollute our environment.
Well, that's an example, as I said earlier, of how the treaty terms and conditions, a treaty term and conditions takes precedent over national legislation and national executive decision-making of agencies and so forth, right? And if that adjudication process does not change, which it hasn't in it, this continues to go on and will continue to go on because you give up your sovereignty. The people give up their sovereignty and their representatives cannot pass legislation that negates the terms and conditions of the treaty. And then the treaty has its own courts. You can't even fight it in the courts, the regular courts, because there are treaty courts, trade courts, where these things have to be discussed and can only be decided.
They made one upgrade to that provision. I don't know if you caught this, but now these tribunals that oversee these trade disputes, as you say, are not the domestic court system. They are these special trade tribunals. And usually the people who are on them are people who have been put on them by the corporations. Yes. And so, as I understand it, NAFTA 2.0 now, somebody on the tribunal can't currently be working for one of the companies involved. It seems like we shouldn't have had this provision for 25 years, but that does seem gone. But these are still very powerful tribunals.
Well, then you just appoint somebody, one of your directors, one of your directors, board of directors law firms, you say, and you put them on it.
Yeah.
They don't work for the company.
That's right.
This is a facade that's been going on with representation on government bodies for a long time.
And I think you started to mention about Big Pharma, but they seem to be some of the biggest winners in NAFTA 2.0 because it really kills off the possibility of generic drugs competing for a big number of years. Gives them longer monopoly provisions on a new drug.
What it does is taking the great benefit position these prescription drug companies have in the U.S., almost untouchable, right?
Yeah.
And in Mexico and Canada, there were more protections. But now it's opened up Mexico and Canada to make it similar. Their rights and their interests have to be similar to what they are in the United States. So it's given them, the big pharma, a much stronger position
in all three countries.
In all three countries now. It's lowered the bar, right?
Yeah.
To the U.S. standard.
To the U.S. lowest standard, yes.
Yeah. That was one of the big issues in the TPP agreement, by the way. The same thing. Big Pharma was the big beneficiary in all the 13 countries in the Pacific trade deal, as it was supposed to be. Big Pharma was one of the big beneficiaries, and those countries really balked at it, like Australia and some of the others. And the Big Pharma, I mean, it's the pharmaceutical companies are maybe the top or the second largest contributor to lobbying in the United States. They're one of the biggest expenditures for lobbies in the United States, and of course you see it here in these trade deals.
And if you understand how pharma works with the ever-increasing prices on research that was done 30 years ago, you understand why they have so much money to pour into to the lobbying efforts. What else do we need to know about NAFTA 2.0? Anything else?
Well, Congress will swiftly pass it because there's nothing really that controversial in it. Trump will then engage in his typical hyperbole and bombast that what a great deal this is for the United States, and at the same time will continue to lose auto jobs and manufacturing jobs.
Yeah. What about labor? They're not going to be quiet on this issue, though. They're going to want to try to actually get some worker protections with some teeth in it. And what I've been reading is that since this will be on a so-called fast track through Congress, as these trade agreements are, because Congress can't rewrite the agreement. They have to either say
up or down,
yes or no. But one thing that they can do is bake into U.S. law in the Implementation Act certain requirements. So they might be looking for some solutions there.
Well, that may be something they try to do, but except for the U.S. House, none of that's going to get through the Senate in the current environment that we have of deregulation and let business have its way on just about everything it wants. So I'm not very optimistic that Labor will be able to get the changes it wants.
Are they going to make a big effort, though? Because, they still have their ends with the Democratic Party, and the House will consider this first because it's a revenue-related bill, so it goes to the House of Representatives.
They'll certainly make an effort, but, the leverage, the political influence and leverage of the industrial unions in particular is virtually nil.
Yeah.
Maybe within certain wings of the Democratic Party, but I doubt even the majority of the Democratic Party. Their influence and leverage is not what it used to be. This is not 30 years ago. Organized union labor is extremely weak politically and economically.
Yeah.
And in this environment, it's really an uphill effort. I would doubt they're going to prevail very much.
And the environmental side of this, there probably won't be any fight at all. It seems like the major environmental groups have given up trying to deal with these trade agreements to the extent that they were invited to participate in the negotiations. Labor had some representatives. The environmental groups said, why bother? And they didn't even go to the negotiations. There's nothing in the deal, and there's probably nothing that could be done through implementation. I've got you here, political economist, and a few minutes remaining. Why don't we just look at the economy? What do you see coming up? You talked about a slowdown. People have been talking about a slowdown even before the shutdown and the trade wars and stuff.
Well, I just wrote a series of my predictions for this year on my blog, jackrasmus.com. People can go check that out. But, as I said earlier, I see the economy weakening in the first quarter here compared to the fourth quarter significantly. Then there will be a little bit of a bounce back, I think, over the late spring and summer. But by the end of the year, I think there's fourth quarter, there's more than a 50-50 chance the U.S. will slip into a recession, I believe.
And what would drive this?
Well, you can see it already. The auto sector and manufacturing now is approaching 50 and a PMI, as they call it, 50 level, which means stagnation, no growth. The auto companies are in contraction. The housing is interest rates.
What is happening with the auto industry? You would think with the economy generally doing well, people are still buying new cars. Are they making the wrong cars, or?
Well, they've had a boom period, and people when the autos cost what they do today, they don't buy new autos every 3 years anymore. You see, and they've kind of maxed out in the U.S. The big market open is still China. The auto production potential. There are over 17 million cars sold in the U.S. for the last couple of years. They can't keep up that rate. Yeah. Right.
So it's just kind of a natural cycle.
It's a natural cycle. Autos are natural cycle. So is housing and construction. And of course, rising interest rates take a whack out of auto financing. Rising interest rates also take a whack out of housing, and housing indicators are all down. So those two important goods-producing sectors are in trouble. We see the tech companies churning. They're, able to just barely keep growing in many cases, at least in the U.S. market. Typically we've got a slowing of the global economy everywhere. Europe is stagnating once again. We have commodity-producing economies, emerging markets are in recession, many of them. We have China slowing down significantly. Japan is stagnating. You can't keep growing when the rest of the world is slowing and stagnating, or worse.
Yeah, because they're buying the stuff.
They're buying a lot of the stuff, right? So we see these indicators in the U.S. and we see these global indicators, and they're all pointing to a a definite slowdown. And then we have what are called tail risks. You know, what's going to happen with Brexit in the UK, what's going to happen with Italian banks. Here and there, you know, different issues beginning to float up. You know, bankruptcies. You know, you got Sears, you got big box retail companies are in trouble. You got General Electric in trouble. These are all, you know, flashing red or yellow lights going on. We're at the end of the cycle here.
It's clear that Brexit is going to be really damaging to the British economy. Could it have global repercussions?
Well, it can have repercussions on currencies. We don't know yet. I predict that there's not going to be a hard Brexit, that they'll kick the can down the road again. I think that's the way the Europeans deal with these problems.
Yeah, I think that's the only thing they can do at this point.
Yeah.
There is no way that they're prepared on either side, Britain or the rest of Europe, for Britain to be out of there on March 29th is the deadline, I think.
Especially when both economies are slowing. You know, it's getting fragile, and a major move like that could just tip the whole thing into a downturn. So, you know, my prediction is we're going to see these tail risks, but Brexit is not one of them. The free trade, the China trade war is not one of them, but there are more fundamental developments that continue to work its way through the U.S. and the global economy that have been slowing it down, and I believe that the cycle will turn here at the end of this year.
Okay, anything else we should know?
Well, I think that's enough, probably.
It probably is. Maybe I'll have you back at the end of the year, and we'll see how you did.
Yeah, we'll see whether my forecast is correct.
Very quick, any new books you're working on?
Yes, I have a book coming out here in 2 months called Alexander Hamilton and the Origins of the Federal Reserve, which is a prequel to my Central Bankers at the End of the Ropes, published last year. Book.
Okay, we're going to have to let it go there. My guest has been Jack Rasmus, political economist, teacher of economics at St. Mary's College. Jack, thanks for joining us and bringing us all your knowledge once again. Thank you for watching Other Voices.